All right, good morning. Certainly where I live, it's still morning. It's 10 a.m. Good to have you here. More people will be signing in. And my name's Doris Livingstone, and I'm the homeschool lead at Action for Canada. And I'm excited to introduce you our guest today, Durenda Wilson. We had her on, like I said, last August, and she's got some really good encouragement for all of us on raising boys to men. Are you a mom of boys? Raising boys in today's cultural climate is a challenge. Boys are often misunderstood and misdiagnosed when they are simply doing what their creator wired them to do. As moms of boys, we can struggle to understand them and respond in a way that will encourage them toward the kind of manhood God has in mind. In Raising Boys to Men, Durenda shares her almost 3 decades of experience raising and homeschooling her 5 boys. She brings wisdom and perspective that will inspire moms to see their sons in a fresh and hopeful way, so moms can raise the next generation of boys to be courageous men of faith and action. Durenda Wilson has been married to Daryl for 34 years. They have 8 kids and 10 grandkids and have been homeschooling for 30 years. That's a little long time. She is a trusted voice and resource at homeschool conventions and on the Durenda Wilson podcast. Durenda is the author of 4 books, and I have them all. The Unhurried Homeschooler, a simple, mercifully short book on homeschooling, and it's an easy read. So what a great book to have on hand. The 4-Hour School Day, which was the interview we did last year in August. There you can see it better. August 22, if you wanted to look that up. How you and your kids can thrive in the homeschool life in 4 hours. And then we've got The Unhurried Grace for a Mom's Heart, 31 Days in God's Word. And then now, today, we've got Raising Boys to Men. This one's nicely worn out. I've already given it to my daughters who have boys, and I took it back so I could prepare for today. And it's a simple, again, mercifully short book on raising and homeschooling boys. Easy to read, folks. Highly recommend this book and all the books. And so we're just excited. Welcome, Durenda Wilson. Thank you for giving us your time and talking about how to raise our precious little boys into great men for God and men of character. And tell us a little bit about why the book is so important for moms right now.
Well, I think that we're in a crisis, both in our culture and even within the church when it comes to masculinity. We're being lied to in all kinds of ways about gender and what masculinity really is. It's actually become trendy to hate men. And this is something that has been growing and building for years and years and years. And so here we sit as moms, knowing that there are real significant, meaningful differences between boys and girls, but are struggling to reconcile what we know to be true about our boys and then what the culture and even much of the church is telling us. And so, what we really need is we need to be equipped, but we need to be equipped biblically. And so that was my hope and prayer as I wrote this book, was that I really wanted to see, I wanted moms to experience what I experienced, just knowing that their boys are fearfully and wonderfully made by God to accomplish his purposes in ways that are unique to men and boys, different than girls, right? And more than anything, I want moms to enjoy raising their sons for the adventure that it truly is. I've sort of, I say all the time, I had 2 goals with this book, a short term goal and a long term goal. The short term goal would be that families would be changed for the good when it comes to raising their sons. And then the long term would be that over time, so in 10 to 15 years, we would see a shift in the culture toward God's word and his ways, because we have raised these young men to be warriors and dragon slayers. And so that's my hope and prayer for this book.
That's awesome. I have a feeling this book is going to be far-reaching, and I hope this video also gets out to so many listeners. I think I agree that we are in a crisis, and it's so good to be talking about this. In your opinion, why are boys often misunderstood and misdiagnosed?
Well, my answer is going to be kind of obvious, but somehow controversial in our culture. That's that boys are boys. They're not girls. And you know, like I said before, we as moms, we know there's a difference, but we're trying to reconcile, you know, kind of like the way everything is in our culture, the way things are set up, for instance, so the educational system, it is set up really to work for girls, not to work for boys. Very few boys thrive in that setting. And I would go as far as to say that the setting is toxic, especially for little boys. And that's why I often just say that the school system is a terrible place for most boys. Our boys were made to be active, busy, competitive, and physical, and all these things are frowned upon within many of our systems that are in place, including the educational system. And so, these features that they have that are actually features, not bugs, are a gift from the Lord, but they are frowned upon and discouraged by, you know, these institutions who are really set up more for a more feminine type of setting. In other words, they're expecting our boys to be like girls, and then we're wondering why we have problems, why they can't sit there for 8 hours a day or even 4 hours when they're younger. You know, like maybe a little girl can sit quite a bit longer than a little boy, and somehow the boy is the one that's broken in that scenario. And so this is where we're running into just such a such a hostile environment for boys, in that they're being misunderstood and misdiagnosed because we're not looking at them the way that God created them and the purposes and the plans that he has for them in being wired that way. So that is something that, you know, I talk a lot about in the book. There's a story that I told about when our son was in the hospital for 2 months straight. The first 2 months of his life, he had open heart surgery when he was 3 days old, and there was an intern, a nurse that was interning, and I kind of got to know her a little bit. And she knew I had, this was our fifth boy, and she had a little boy, and she was telling me how he had so many problems in the classroom. He was maybe 6 years old, and I looked at her and I just said, I know what the problem is. And she was just like wide-eyed and ready to hear whatever I had to say. And I leaned over and I said, it's because he knows that he's supposed to be digging in the dirt and playing with worms and building forts and riding his bike. And she sort of looked at me like I had three heads. But the thing that's interesting about our children, is they know early on, they know what they were made for. They have a desire to do the things that they developmentally need to be doing, and boys need to be moving, not sitting in a classroom writing essays.
I was just reading a comment here. It in the chat, my 11-year-old boy says I might like school if it was only 2 hours, and how true that is, because
Mm-hmm.
especially when they're young, you can get a lot done in an hour even,
Absolutely.
and the rest of the time, get them outside.
Yeah, yeah. You know, when I talk, when
Burn,
when
burn,
I
burn.
right, when I was on before and talked about the 4 hour school day, I want people to understand that it's not 4 hours for a kindergartner. And when our kindergartners did, you know, zero, maybe 30 minutes a day, and there was a slow building from there. But at the end of the day, we still didn't go really much more than 4 hours, even for our high schoolers. And so, yes, that's the beauty of homeschooling, is it is efficient and it is effective. And so we can get so much more done in way less time. The teacher's student ratio is amazing, and that's actually one of the number one predictors for a student's success. And so, just by taking our kids home, we've immediately given them a leg up because of the teacher student ratio is so much better at home than it would be in a classroom. Even with my 8 kids, it was great.
Yeah, yeah. You did answer a couple of the questions here about what we can expect from boys. And when we see the aggression in the boy, how concerned should a parent be?
Well,
And
yeah.
yeah, and should we add some boundaries to that?
Right. Well, I do talk about boundaries. I'll go into that in just a minute. But the first thing that we need to be thinking about in our concern for our boys being aggressive is going back to what I mentioned before, that boys were wired by their creator toward aggressiveness. Now, there's a sliding scale. You can have a little boy on this end who's far less aggressive, um, and then you could have one over here who's majorly aggressive. And so there's going to be varying approaches to how you're going to handle that aggressiveness. But again, that aggressiveness is not a bug, it's a feature. Our boys were created to build, lead, protect, provide, and conquer. And, I often tell the story about how I read in a book called The Minds of Boys. I really just read one chapter, and it was the most helpful thing I ever read. It was on boys' aggressiveness. It was talking about how how you and I will sit and have a cup of coffee and talk, and that's how we bond. For boys, it is that competitive, the wrestling, the physical activity, even the just punching each other, things like that. That's how they bond. And when I read that, I had my five boys at the time, and although I couldn't relate to it, I understood what was being said because I
Mhm.
saw it in my boys. And so this is again a feature, not a bug. And God isn't calling us to raise nice guys. He's calling us to raise warriors and dragon slayers. And I think the culture does not appreciate or recognize aggression as a good thing, first of all, because they don't recognize the creator. And having a creator changes everything in how we approach life, how we approach parenting, how we approach our education with our kids. But the culture in general doesn't appreciate aggression because we aren't running for our lives anymore. There was a day not that long ago when we needed men who could protect the women and children because they were very vulnerable. And now we live in a society that is, there's a lot more safety in place, but we still need men for protection. And I would say that one of the bigger areas right now is that we need men who are willing to fight against the moral and political overreach that's determined to destroy the family. And so we need men who are kind and understand how to help the helpless, but they're not afraid to wage war when necessary because they love what and who they're fighting for. And so, again, with all of that in mind, it is important that we have boundaries with our boys, very firm, clear boundaries. Although they're wired to lead, build, protect, provide, and conquer, often they start out doing it poorly. So often we'll see them trying to do one of those things, but they're unsure and not wise enough to know how to do that. So I'll give you an example. You've got a little boy and his sister, and another brother or a friend is there, and the friend or brother gets a little rough with his sister, and he doesn't like it, so he just hauls off and decks him. Okay. Well, we see what he was trying to do there, but the way that he did it was not wise. And so we as parents need to teach our boys how, with discernment and wisdom, to lead, build, protect, provide, and conquer. So by nature, boys do want to lead. That is something that they have a desire to do. And although this is a blessing, in order to be good leaders, they first have to go through the training that scripture describes. So they need to go through that time in their childhood where they need to obey their parents in the Lord, for this is right. They need to honor their father and mother so that it will go well with them. And we teach that through discipline and setting boundaries, and um, really training is what I would call it. And I describe this in the book on the chapter on discipline, that there are a couple of kinds of training. So we don't believe as Christians um, that discipline is about punishment. It's not punitive because we believe that Jesus died to pay he took the punishment for our sins. However, our children do misbehave and they need consequences. And the consequences should match the crime as closely as possible. And I'll give you an example of what that looks like. Same example, different training scenarios. So you've got a dad who and mom who have told the son, okay, we need you to chop this pile of wood here. We need you to split this by Friday. It needs to be done and stacked. Well, the son is lazy and distracted and doesn't focus and doesn't get the job done by the end of the week. And now the family's ready to go do something really, really fun. But his parents look at him and say, I'm sorry, you can't come. You didn't finish what we asked you to finish. And so you need to stay here and finish that. So that's one kind of training. The other kind is when the dad is out chopping wood and he calls his son out to help him. And his son says, well, am I in trouble? Do I have to do this because I did something wrong? And the dad's saying, no, this is just a skill that I believe that you need to learn how to do. And so we're going to work on training you in this particular skill. And of course, that could apply to so many different areas of life. So, our job as parents is to train our children. And part of training involves boundaries because what we want to do is we want to teach our boys and our children to self regulate. And so that's why boundaries are very, very important with boys. They have to learn that how to serve and how to listen and how to respect authority and honor authority before they can be in leadership. And so um, their childhood and as we're raising them is that's the preparation time for that.
That's good. So Durenda, you share an acronym in Raising Boys to Men that makes it easier for moms to remember what their boys need. Can you share that acronym now and what it stands for?
Sure. Well, I made it something that would be easy, particularly for moms of boys to remember. So the acronym is BURP. So B is for boundaries, U is for use few words, R is for respect and responsibility, and P is for prayer. So that was a way to sort of reduce everything down to something you could remember. But I have a chapter in each book that expounds on all of those things.
You, I think it's great. I think the word burp definitely it should stick with almost everybody.
Yeah, yeah, it is an easy one to remember, and I think when we're in the midst of parenting, it can be easy to forget these wonderful things we read in books. So if we can just think boundaries, use few words, respect and responsibility, prayer, what do I need to be engaging in right at this moment? It kind of sometimes half our brain shuts off when we're stressed out, so it helps a lot to have a way to remember that.
Yeah. The use few words, I think that really stuck with me because I'm a mom of daughters,
Hmm.
but just remembering like when communicating with my husband, it was still applicable.
Hmm.
Fewer words got better results than these long drawn out conversations that they just I don't know if like I said, I've got grandsons and I'm learning
Right.
that glazed look of you're losing them because the words are too long. It's too much information.
Right, right. Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. Um, you write that work is a gift from the Lord and that building a strong work ethic in our boys is one of the greatest gifts we can give them. Why do you believe this is true?
Well, our kids can have all kinds of skills and ability, but if they have no work ethic, those skills and abilities are not going to serve them nearly as well. The great thing about a work ethic is it really gives our kids more opportunities over time. We have seen this as we've built this into our own children. They do the things for us. We had them in that training, and then they started working for neighbors and friends, and then pretty soon they had jobs. And the feedback we continually got was they're just so hardworking. Like we just it's hard to find an employee or someone to work for us that has the kind of work ethic that your kids do. And so they were highly sought after. And this is happening also in their lives and careers as adults. Constantly being made another offer for to work for someone else. And so so much of it comes back to this strong work ethic. And our kids have said, it's one of the best things you ever taught us was how to work hard. The thing that's great about having a strong work ethic is it teaches perseverance and resilience. It brings out heart issues along the way that need to be dealt with. If we just let our kids kind of go do what they want versus requiring work out of them, we miss the opportunities to deal with the character issues that are in fact there, and really need to and should be dealt with under our roof, as much as possible before they leave home. Also, a work ethic, giving them a work ethic, specifically with boys, it gives them something to conquer. And this is something I talk about throughout the book, how important it is that we give our boys a lot of physical activity, including a lot of physical work, and all the reasons why that is the case and ways to do that. I have practical tips in the book, and just some ways and some examples, some stories. But a strong work ethic also builds confidence in our kids and skill sets, and it prepares them for life. Work is a gift from the Lord. God told Adam and Eve, he gave them dominion over the garden before the fall. So work wasn't something that happened as a result of the fall. Everything that happened before the fall, God called it good. So work is good. It is a blessing, and we're made for it. We are literally made to work. We all know how good it feels at the end of a day that we have worked hard. There's this satisfaction and this gratification that is difficult to find anywhere else. And so if we can instill that in our kids, wow, what a gift we give them for life.
And as women too, it's very appealing to see that in a future spouse,
Hmm.
to see that a man knows how to work.
Yes.
It's not even so much about like having a high paying job. It's that
Hmm.
he has the ability to work and take care of himself, um, by working hard at whatever it is he's doing.
Right, right. Well,
And
there's that provision, that you see that ability to provide. And that's not a selfish desire to want in a husband. It's a godly desire to want, because that's what they were, one, built for, and two, just God has ordained them to do that. And so, to want that, to desire that, to see that as attractive is a very natural and normal and godly thing to be looking for.
mhm, yeah. And just another thought about work too, because in homeschooling you can condense the amount of hours of actual like formal teaching time or school time. As my kids got into being teenagers, we lived in a town that was a tourist town, and so all the seasonal jobs would open up around April, and so they were always snatched up first,
Mm-hmm.
because not only were they available after lunch to start to go to a job,
Right.
but they had the work ethic already. And I
Mm-hmm.
mean, it starts so young as like when they're sweeping the floor, because we want them to learn how to sweep the floor, and they may not get it quite right that first time. And so as a parent, sometimes it can be a little painful, like, I would rather just do it myself. It'll just be faster, it'll be more efficient. But taking that extra minute and walking the child through, like, oh, there's a little bit in the corner there. Let's do that together. Let's clean that up. And then 4 or 5 times of that, they know how to sweep a floor. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's that early groundwork that by the time they're 13, 14, they know a lot of things, because we've
Mm-hmm.
taken the extra minute in their earlier life to show them how to do something thoroughly.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly
Yeah,
right.
yeah, and it's all part of the whole work ethic thing. Instead of
Mm-hmm.
doing a haphazard job somewhere, like they're doing it thoroughly and they're doing it respectfully, they're doing it properly, they're finishing timely, all those little things that matter. And employers really notice that. My brother has been a boss, and when he was in charge of scheduling. And one of the biggest complaints he had was, yes, he was dealing with high graduated university students going into his industry, but they didn't either know how to treat the customer, they didn't know how to get along with their colleagues, they
Mm-hmm.
didn't know how to sort of like really invest at work and be thorough. And so those are the qualities he's now looking for, or he was at the time when he was still hiring,
Mm-hmm.
was besides the qualification of the university degree, what's their work ethic like? I don't even
Right.
know how you learn that when you're hiring on the spot, but it's becoming more prominent, I find, over the years. And
Oh yeah, yeah.
what a
It's
gift we give our boys, right?
yeah,
If we
it's
teach them how to
definitely
work.
problematic in our culture, and we're seeing more and more and more of it. In fact, it's getting to the point where some businesses are willing to bypass the degree for someone who's self-motivated, knows how to work, knows how to be a team member, knows how to complete a task completely. Okay, so listen to everything that we're describing. Our kids can learn this through chores at home and through working alongside of each other. So their brothers and sisters are their coworkers and you are the boss. And so they're learning all of that at home through everyday life with our kids. Chores should be part of our kids' day, their daily rhythm. Chores should be part of their it's part of their education. So to see that as a separate thing or an obstacle to real education is really it's a lie. It's a deceit because that is part and parcel. In fact, I would go as far as to say it's more important than making massive amounts of progress in the books. And because if our kids are motivated, they know how to follow directions, they're willing to learn, they know how to pivot, they get along with others, they can learn anything. So the sky's the limit on what they can do, really. I mean, so yes, a work ethic is an absolute gift.
Yeah. Thank you for just expounding on that. Why do you think are the what do you think are the biggest challenges for moms of boys?
Well, I think the biggest challenge is that we are so different from them and it can be difficult to understand them. And so, what automatically happens is also because we live in a culture that's very much leans toward feminine everything. Women are always right, men are always wrong. Women are, far superior, men are not, just this whole thing. And even though we know in our heads that's a lie, that's not true, it's so part of our culture that it has informed our thinking, whether we realize it or not. So the challenge is to respect the God-given nature of our boys and direct their energy in productive directions. I heard a mom once say her biggest job as a mom of boys is to employ and exhaust. So this understanding that the biggest part of our job is to direct that God-given energy. So I heard a gentleman once told me that there are three um, questions that are going through the minds of boys all the time. Number one, who's in charge? Number two, who's on my team? And number three, what are we doing? Or, in other words, what is our mission? They have this need to conquer. So, often when boys are misbehaving or doing things that they shouldn't, I'm not excusing that behavior, but I am saying as parents, we do have a certain amount of responsibility to keep directing that. What we can do is when they start to go that direction, stop and ask ourselves, what are they asking? Are they asking who's in charge? Are they asking who's on their team? Are they asking, what is their mission? Or maybe more than one of those questions, and then try to answer those questions. So we're repeatedly answering those questions for our boys all day long. And we're doing that by keeping the boundaries, by letting them know we are on their team. We're doing things for their good. We want to see them grow up to be strong men who know how to be good leaders. And right now, that means you've got to honor mom and dad, and you have to learn to, respond well to your siblings and work hard and all these different things. And then we give them regular missions. Even from the time they're very, very little. I had our little 15-month-old grandson. He was following me around, and sometimes he wasn't whining, but sometimes they are. Even if they are, they're whining, or they just seem sort of directionless. And so I said, Van, come with me. Let's go to the freezer. He follows me to the freezer. I pull out a couple packages of meat. I hand him one. I say, can you carry this for me? And so he carries it. He's very proud of himself. And we both walk to the kitchen, and I put the bowl down, and I say, okay, put it in the bowl. So just those kinds of things repeatedly throughout the day. Can you help mom with this? Can and I'm not saying we're just running them all day long, but I would say that they need that kind of direction more than we would guess. So, to respect the God given nature of boys and direct their energy is one of the biggest challenges. The second one is to not parent emotionally. So, this is really tempting for us as women because we're nurturers and we're more emotional by nature. This is a good thing, this is a gift from the Lord. But we have to remember that our emotions they can be a great warning light, but they are a terrible GPS. So there are times that boys do some crazy, unexpected things, and our job is to respond, not react. So I actually have an episode on responsive parenting versus reactive parenting, talk about more clearly what the difference is between those two, but I think you can kind of guess by the terms that I used. We don't want to respond emotionally, and we don't want to parent emotionally. Our boys will not respect that. They will not respect it. Things will get worse, not better. The best thing for boys is to have very clear boundaries and very clear consequences if those boundaries aren't kept. And typically physical consequences work the best. I mean, push-ups, sit-ups. Um, I think about, like our maybe a 14-year-old or whatever, our 14-year-old boys as they were growing up. It was just, sometimes they would be mouthy to me. They would say something disrespectful to me, and I would be, all right, on the floor, 10 push-ups right now. You do not talk to me that way. So you almost have to have a little bit of the the attitude or position of a sergeant, which is not comfortable for me as a nurturer, but it's necessary. It was necessary for our sons, and every boy is different, but I would say that overall that method, that approach worked well with our boys, and does work well with most boys. And again, as parents, you take that and you use what works and use discernment and all of that. But I think as moms, we really struggle to, because we don't understand it and can't relate to it. It doesn't cross our minds to approach it like that. And this is where husbands can come in very, very, they can be very, very helpful. I learned pretty early on to go to my husband, especially when it came to discipline issues with the boys, because he understood them. He understood what they needed. And some of his ideas, I only went with him because I had nothing left. I was worn out, pooped out, had no more answers. I didn't have a better solution. So we went with it and it worked. So don't forget, moms, to go to your husbands and ask them to help you understand and approach your sons and their discipline in a way that works well for them.
I totally agree. And if there are already single moms here, I'm sure you can find an uncle or some sort of male role model where you can uh, have that man build those sort of principles into your son. Um, Maybe there, or even your dad if he's young enough, or a brother, or a trusted friend.
Mhm.
Find somebody who can help you with that if you are on
Yeah.
your own as a single mom.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
would preface that with saying, ask the Lord to bring somebody along and for you to recognize that that is who needs to be the mentor to your son. The other thing I would recommend highly is Trail Life USA. I don't know if they have it in Canada though. That might be the difference. In the States here, we have an organization called Trail Life USA. It basically replaced the Boy Scouts when the Boy Scouts started going a direction that a lot of believers didn't want to go. Um, so there may be an organization, I don't know, in your area, I'm not sure, in your province, where they have something like that, where they will have godly men who volunteer, and so your son can be matched up with somebody to help mentor them, and they camp and they fish and they do all the guy things together with this organization.
Also, Durenda, going back to this, the very beginning of what you're talking about, you had those three questions. I just wanted to post them in the chat. What were those three questions?
Who's in charge?
There it is. Yeah.
Who's on my team?
Mm-hmm.
And what are we doing, or what is our mission?
Well, those are super great questions. Yeah, I mean, if you have them in the forefront of your mom brain,
Hmm.
probably every day.
Right.
I'm sure that would
Absolutely.
help.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that employing and exhausting is huge. And I don't know, I found that no matter the personality, my boys loved it. They loved to be able to know what it is they were supposed to be doing and then go do it. There's this desire to conquer for them, even if it's a small thing or a big thing. Um, they come away satisfied just through accomplishment. And so as moms, if we can kind of keep that energy going in a productive way, in a productive direction, we're training them to be productive, to be producers as opposed to consumers. We all consume to a certain degree, but I really believe it's important to raise kids and to be people who produce more than we consume.
Now, you homeschooled all of your sons from kindergarten to graduation. In what
Yes.
ways did their education look different from your daughter's education? You talked a little bit about that in the beginning, about how the school
Right.
system is tailored to girls. Tell us about your experience.
Well, my experience was they needed a lot more physical activity. So typically for our boys between subjects, I would send them if I would ask them. Sometimes they were ready to move on because they just wanted to get through it. They wanted to conquer it. And then they would have that free time in the afternoon that we always gave them. But often they would take a break between subjects. They would go out and jump on the trampoline, do some jumping jacks, just go do something physical in between their subjects. I would set a timer. Otherwise, I might forget about them because there were a lot of kids. And all of a sudden, I realized it's noon and so had never came back. So I would set a timer and call them back in. And that was the deal. I would tell them, I'm happy to do this. I want you to have this break. But if you don't come back when I call you, then the deal's off and you're just going to have to keep going. And they did not want that. So, physical activity, typically, especially in the early years, more hands on type things, more experiential type things, um, curriculum that used less words. Whether I took a curriculum I had and just reduced the amount of words used, or whether I specifically chose something simpler to avoid the overuse of words. Again, brain breaks. Sometimes the brain breaks weren't necessarily physical. Sometimes they would choose to go play with Legos, and Legos would reset their brain. Creativity will do that, physical activity will do that. A lot of times my boys learned things better through experience than through reading a book. The other thing that I did with them was I really encouraged them to own what they were doing. So I didn't hover over them while they were doing their schoolwork. My girls were a little more relational and liked to do more relational things. And the boys were more like, let's set the goals and then let me conquer it, is what they wanted. And often, even when they were struggling with something, I was always close by for questions or whatever, for help that they needed. They tended not to ask me. And sometimes I would see their faces and they would be grimacing and making all kinds of, you know, faces that said they were really struggling. And I would go over there and say, hey, do you need some help? And they would say, no, I want to do it myself. And what developed from that was these massive problem solving skills that were they to this day are benefiting them greatly as adults. They don't look at problems and think, "Oh, I can't do this." Or immediately say somebody has to help me or somebody has to do this for me. They are like, "How do I figure out how to do this?" That's their mindset, and that happened in those early years when they were just simply doing schoolwork, and I encouraged that independence. And so those were some of the things that I did differently with the boys.
That kind of lines up with my next question here. Why do you think it's so important to take an unhurried approach to homeschooling, especially with boys? Won't this cause them to fall behind in their education?
Yeah, the idea that if we don't start education, or what I mean by when we use that word education, we're often speaking about book work and curriculum. But kids are learning all the time, and this idea that if we don't start book work early, they're going to be a failure or they're going to get behind is a myth. It is a myth. It's one of the reasons I wrote The Unhurried Homeschooler and the 4-Hour School Day, because this if we follow our kids' natural love for learning and we start reading and writing with them when they seem ready, they will respond so much better. And studies have actually proven that there's no advantage to starting early. In fact, the opposite is true, especially with boys. When boys are pressured with too much too soon, they give up. And they might show up physically, but they've already checked out and they're not being encouraged to love learning. In fact, they're actually we're pushing them the opposite direction. So we want them to equate good emotions and experiences as much as possible with learning, especially in the early years, because we're building their relationship with learning and we want that to be a positive one. It doesn't mean they never have to do something they don't want to do, but I really, especially in the early years, tried to make them practice the doing the hard things more in real life scenarios than in the book work. Because I don't think developmentally they're ready for that challenge of I'm going to push myself to do 10 more math problems or get through this hard math problem. That is something that happens later on as they get older when their brains are more developed. But in the early years, all they do is look at it and feel like a failure and feel stressed and pressured, and that creates a negative relationship with learning, and that's the opposite of what we want. So we want to start out when they seem ready and then gently move forward slowly as they are ready. And the thing that's interesting is we never think about this, but forced learning is not real learning. When learning is forced upon us as opposed to something we want and we see the need for, it changes everything. It just we retain it so much longer, typically for life, when it's something we want to learn either by desire or by need, because we're looking at this going like a little boy who is trying to figure something out and he realizes I need more information, but I don't know how to read. This is what happened to our grandson. Once he realized, okay, I don't want to sit around and wait for mom to help me look this up anymore. I want to be able to do this myself. So when they see that need, then all of a sudden, man, they can move forward at lightning speed. I always liken it to digging post holes in Alaska. Like you can chink away at the ice all the way through winter if you want to and make some sort of progress, or you can just wait until the spring thaw and all of a sudden it takes you a fraction of the time. And the same thing is true for learning.
I'm just reading a comment in the chat to specifically to what you're talking about. I don't know if you want to have a quick look at it. There's a mom talking about her 11-year-old son who's not motivated to do anything, but he loves sports. So my input to that would be tailor any of the writing and the reading around the sports he's interested in.
Yes.
And if there's statistics, you start bringing in the math,
Right.
um, and for him to understand more statistics, he'd probably have to get more grounded in some basic math skills. Like you said, with reading, if your grandson learns how to read, then his world opens up. Do you have any more thoughts on how to encourage this mom? Because he's 11 and he just loves sports, but he doesn't want to do his schoolwork.
Well, I everything you said was just spot on. If you can tailor his writing, tailor his reading, to even tailor his math around sports, I think you'll see a massive shift. And I would have that conversation with him. You know, help him understand that the reason you're trying to teach these things to him is so that he can understand these things better. And that might help motivate him as well. In saying those things, you're answering that question, who's on my team? Mom's on your team. Mom's on your team. She wants you to succeed. So, and then you can say, I've noticed you love sports. Let's see if we can, um, you know, revolve everything you're trying to learn, and what needs to be accomplished, learning how to read and write and do basic math, let's do it through sports and figure it out together. I think it would be a mission. It would be a team thing. You're also saying to a certain degree, you are on his team, but you're also in charge, and now you have a mission. So, I think that would be and that's the beauty of homeschooling. You have the freedom to do that.
Yeah, very good advice. Um, how will moms who have boys with special needs benefit from reading this book?
Well, boys are boys, whether they have special needs or not. We have a son who is on the spectrum, and I have found that his needs are essentially very similar to his brothers, but my approach has had to be different with him. So, I think just remembering that our boys might need to experience building and protecting and providing and conquering in different ways. And those ways may be smaller compared to the average child or different, but they are no less meaningful. They need to be meaningful to your son. And the other thing I think we really need to bear in mind, because they are boys and have the same needs, is that they need to know that they are an asset, especially when they realize, as many of them do, that there's some differences, there are some uniquenesses to the way their brains work. My son and I talk about this frequently. That God has wired him and put him together, and for a very specific plan and purpose. So there's no mistake here. There's no uh, I don't know how to say it. It's not that he's less than, or that he, and certainly not that he's a liability. That So we want to communicate to them that they are an asset in all the ways that they are an asset, even if it's small ways. And so I actually have a section in my book where I talk about this. But again, we go back to the fact that boys are boys, whether they have special needs or not. I did a podcast episode on getting our special needs boys outside, and it was just a fabulous conversation with a friend of mine who does this, and the importance of it and how to do it in a way that, because it can be kind of scary for those of us who have kids with special needs, because there are all kinds of variables in the equation that might not otherwise be there. But there's so much encouragement in that episode to in how to do it, and then just to do it and why it's important.
In raising boys to men, you encourage moms to remain teachable.
Hmm.
Why do you think this is especially important for moms of boys?
Well, I think because we do end up in more scenarios where we're embarrassed, where we are looking at our boys and wondering what in the world, and sometimes we also end up in scenarios like I found myself in several years ago, when our youngest was about 5 years old, and we had our kids in church with us. And I noticed he was especially wiggly that day, but didn't think he was being terribly disruptive. And church ended, and I stood up and I turned around, and I had this woman in my face, just almost yelling at me, telling me that I needed to get my son under control. And I mean, I have high standards for our kids, and I didn't feel like he was really out of line, but she really took issue. And it was like I got hit by a bus. I don't even remember how I responded. I didn't, I didn't strike back or I wasn't angry towards her. I was just completely flabbergasted and almost paralyzed. Got in the car, and had a good cry, and I was telling my husband about it, and I was praying about it. And the thought occurred to me, and this hasn't always occurred to me, but it did in this situation, to just ask myself. It was like God was saying, Durenda, was there anything true in what she said? Even though this was a really ugly package, look for the potential gift here. And I had to admit, I probably hadn't been quite as, disciplined with our youngest, because he's on the spectrum and because he was the youngest, and just a lot of different reasons. You all can probably relate. The youngest, you get older and you get tired also, and you've got all these other kids. And so I probably needed to just be a little more diligent with him. And that was my takeaway. And there was this peace that came over me, and just this thankfulness for that tiny little gift that the Lord had given me, and I could forget about the rest. And so I think as moms of boys, we tend to be mama bears, and that can be a really good thing. It has its place, but sometimes we also need to recognize that maybe our boys do need a little bit of tweaking or a little bit of extra work on some character, and be open to hearing that message, even if it comes in, like I said, in an ugly package, because we want to make sure that we are doing right by our boys ultimately in the big picture of things.
No, that's really, really good. I learned from homeschooling my kids how teachable I had to become.
Hmm.
So you become teachable, first of all, when you become a parent. And then when you add the whole thing of homeschooling, you learn so much about yourself and what you still need to learn. And being teachable and being open
Right.
is very helpful. Absolutely. Yeah. Before we wrap up here, I do want to address a question in the chat. And you do talk about it in your book about screen time. If you scroll back, I don't know if you want to look at the question, but what is your take on allowing screens in the tweener stage, so ages 10 to 12? Do screens and video games take away from work ethic in the homeschool? And what have you noticed? Did you even allow video games?
So we avoided screens as long as possible. And we did not have a video gaming system in our home until my husband decided it was time. And I was still dragging my feet, but he said, I think we should do this. And, it's better for our boys to learn how to manage this under our roof than, when they're adults and they've been, they're just on their own. So I went with it, and it did require a lot of oversight on my part, and it was sometimes exhausting. But we limited their game time to 30 minutes a day. And whether or not screens and videos take away from work ethic in the homeschool is really up to you as the parent. So, what I mean by that is when you recognize that it is starting to do that, it is your job to stop that. So, one of the things that we used to do is periodically we would take a Sabbath. We would take a break from screens, even though they technically had 30 minutes a day each. I would just put, usually it happened when I felt like it was getting to be a lot to manage. There was some stepping, little bit of stepping over boundaries, and so there, at that point there were four of them who could game and be on screens, and so I would, when I found myself just sort of overwhelmed by it, and I just took that as a signal from the Lord that it was time to maybe take a break. So I would tell them, "Okay, you guys, you haven't done anything wrong, but." And sometimes they had. Sometimes it's like, you guys have been pressing the limits on this for several days now, so we're going to take a break. So it could be a consequence, but also there are times I just said, we just need a break from this. And immediately their response to that told me so much about how tied they were to those video games, whether those video games had become a god to them, they had become more important than anything else, that they were willing to maybe be very disrespectful to me, throw a fit, um, get angry. And initially I expect the response to be negative, but if they dialed it back in really quickly, then I knew, okay, this is good. We're taking a break, but I can see that, they're able to keep that under control. Their responses to not being able to play will tell you a lot about where their heart is with it. So, in terms of how it takes away from the work ethic in the homeschool, I would say work comes first. If you're not getting your work done first, the morning chores, the early afternoon chores, whatever, whenever you have chores, then that's a privilege you lose, because being able to game was a privilege. It wasn't a right. And so it worked well as a reward. There were certain times I said, you know what, you did such a good job today. I'm going to give you 15 minutes extra. So it gave me a little more of a reward consequence system that actually mattered to them. It was currency. It was their currency. Um, and I tried not to overuse it, but then also I had it there to say, you know what? You have not actually been very responsible this week. I've had to warn you, I've had to remind you to do your chores. And so you're going to have to skip gaming today, and then again, you'll get to see the response to it. It won't be positive, but then the more intense the response, the more days I made him take off. So that is completely in your court, parents, to navigate that, to make that decision, and to be watching for the negative repercussions on that.
That's good. We've only got time for one more question, and then there's going to be a couple closing comments here. When you homeschooled your kids, did you have to work full-time from home as well? So you could actually answer that personally, and then I have some thoughts on that as well.
They're just asking if I worked full time.
Yeah, I
Heck
guess.
no.
Yeah.
No, I had 8 children in 13 years. That was a full-time, more than a full-time job. So, yes, I worked, but I did not work away from home. And I've had parents ask me, when I wrote the 4-hour school day, one of the things that my literary agent wanted me to do was to, speak to the parent who works part-time, speak to the parents who work full-time, and how they can homeschool and work full-time. And I said, I don't think I can do that. And the reason is, and there could be exceptions to this, but I think as a rule, we have 24 hours in a day, and the whole, to me, the driving force behind homeschooling is to be present, to be there with my children, to disciple them, to train them. I can't do that if I'm gone. And so I will say my husband and I gave up a lot of conveniences. We gave up an extra car. We drove one car for a really long time, and he worked outside the home 3 days a week, and I had little kids. I couldn't go anywhere. But we both looked at each other and said, this is worth it. We want to homeschool. We're in this for the long haul. We are committed to this. So we're going to figure it out. That season didn't last a really long time, but I had to be willing to do that. I had to be willing to make sacrifices in order to homeschool our kids. And I can't tell someone else what to do. And I can't tell them that it's absolutely impossible to work full time and homeschool your kids, because maybe you have a situation where you have a good support parents who are willing to watch the kids and pull off some of the homeschooling, and you're on the same page. That's a possibility. But I think if that's not the case, it might be something where you need to step back and reevaluate your life, your finances, and all of that, and decide if there's anything you could cut back on in order to be able to work less and be at home more in order to homeschool your kids. Because I don't know, one of the reasons that my husband and I were so committed to our family, and I can tell you, we have a very strong, cohesive family, and it's not a perfect family, but we all have really good relationships with each other. There's not bitterness and resentment between any of us because we worked on that along the way, day in, day out, as we lived our lives together. That doesn't just happen. You have to invest. You have to be present. You have to be there to do that. And one of the reasons we were so committed to that in homeschooling is because when we were young and first started having children, we made a point of asking a bunch of older people their thoughts on having children, their work, their careers, whether some of them had very successful businesses. They owned half of downtown or whatever. Every single one of them said, my only regret is not spending more time with my family, or not having more kids. That was their biggest regret. They had met all the what people would say, all the goals for success, and yet that is what they longed for. And so at the end of the day, we don't want to have regrets. We don't want to look back and say, gosh, I sacrificed this for that, and I wished I hadn't. So I encourage you to maybe take a step back and think that through.
No, very true. I have heard that as well, people commenting their regrets, and same ones. And I have to say too, in the earliest years, we were on one vehicle, and I was homebound a lot, or I would drive my husband to work. He didn't live too far away, so I had the car until we were able to afford a second vehicle later when the kids were older. And we made that choice too, like, this is really important. One of the things we did regarding employment is we did start a couple home businesses. And so because my husband was a shift worker, when he worked the 8 to 8 shift, 8 p.m. to 8 a.m., and the kids were in bed, that's when I went down to the office, and I could work at my own pace. I was the office manager, so I could work at my own pace. As long as I did everything in the month, it didn't matter. As long as I got it done in every month, I was in a good place. So if you're creative and courageous to think outside the box and you need extra income, that doesn't require you to leave your family. So my kids would be in bed and then I'd be working. I 2 hours
Right.
a
Right.
night. There's a little window there to make things happen.
Yeah, and there's also this whole idea of a family business. Starting a family business with you can involve the kids in if they're, especially not necessarily when they're little, but when they get a little bit older, even, 8, 9, 10, they can be helpful and learn so much. It can be one of the ways that we homeschool our kids and educate them is through our home business. So that's another, and with the internet and in all that we have at our fingertips, I feel like the sky's the limit. It's just deciding what's going to work for your family.
Yeah, totally. And that's exactly what we did. So on my husband's days off, after lunch, he'd take the kids down to the work property. He'd give them a job, and
Mhm.
they learned how to work side by side with him.
Yeah, yeah,
And
that's
it gave
wonderful.
me a break, and they loved being outside with their dad. It
Mhm.
was great. Yeah. So we're going to wrap up here. Durenda, where can moms connect with you and find your book,
Well, you can find my book on Amazon.
Raising
Oh,
Boys to
just a little
Men?
side note, that's my grandson on the front.
Okay.
That's my grandson, and then his daddy is on the back if you flip it over. I think you have that one. Yes.
Oh,
That's our son Luke,
okay.
and then his son Sully. And so we just thought it would be a really awesome thing to have the little boy on the front, so because you're raising boys to men, and then have a man, our son, on the back. So it was just a fun. It was neat how the Lord brought it together. But yeah, you can find the book on Amazon. And you can find all my books on Amazon. And then you can find me at the Durenda Wilson podcast. I really encourage you to go over there. I have over 500 episodes. And if you go to the podcast page on my website, there's a search bar at the top. You can put in any keyword and episodes will come up. It is just a massive amount of mentoring. That is really what I'm doing over there is mentoring moms. And so I encourage you to go there. And then, of course, I have a website, durendawilson.com.
Yeah, I just put your website in there.
Great. And the podcast is on the website. You can listen from there, or you
Okay.
can listen from Spotify, iTunes, pretty much any platform.
Yeah, Instagram you mentioned, Facebook as well.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah. And for those of you who came in later on, these are the other books that you had heard, Homeschooler, and Durenda had talked about that briefly. I did a webinar with Durenda last August. It's on our website, The 4-Hour School Day, if you wanted to pick up that book. And Unhurried Grace for a Homeschool Mom's Heart,
Yes.
or a mom's heart.
Yeah, it's a devotional for homeschool
Yeah,
moms.
all
Mhm.
moms. Thank you, Durenda, for spending time with us. And
Thank you for having me.
yeah, you are full of encouragement and inspiration. You've definitely lived the journey, and I can tell by your deep thoughts and reflections on how to be a homeschool mom and raise our little boys to be just great men and warriors, and it's just beautiful. So on that great note, thank you, Durenda, and we're going to say goodbye to everybody and see you in May. Bye-bye.